In discussions in normative ethics, you will often hear about the big three: deontology, consequentialism, and virtue ethics. These are the main ethical theories in philosophy, and they all try to give their own account of what is right and wrong. But sometimes philosophers like to make things even simpler. We can divide ethical theories into two fundamental camps: consequentialism and non-consequentialism. In this episode, we will do a deeper dive into what consequentialism is, what the history of the concept is, and what its problems are. In the broadest sense, the name pretty much tells you what consequentialism is. Morally speaking, only the consequences of your actions matter. Non-consequentialism, by contrast, claims that other things than the consequences matter for the moral evaluation of actions. These other things can be duties, obligation, character traits, and so on. Even though philosophy dates back thousands of years, researchers argue that the term consequentialism is actually quite new. Its first use is credited to the philosopher Elizabeth Anscombe in her seminal paper Modern Moral Philosophy, published in 1958. In her paper, Anscombe distinguishes ethical theories that are concerned with consequences and contrasts them with those that hold certain things forbidden, whatever consequences threaten, such as choosing to kill the innocent for any purpose, however good, vicarious punishment, treachery, idolatry, sodomy, adultery, making false profession to faith, and so on. In a nutshell, one mark of consequentialist theories is that they do not have any categorical prohibitions. Whether or not an action is morally right always depends on the consequences it produces. But this definition of consequentialism only gives us a theory of right, that is, an account of what makes actions right or wrong. But consequentialism itself does not give us a theory of value. Even if we know that only the consequences of our actions matter, we still need to know which consequences count. In the context of consequentialism, utilitarianism is the most famous theory of value. The consequences that matter are those that maximize happiness and minimize suffering. With both a theory of right and a theory of value, you get a clearer ethical theory. Utilitarianism is such a paradigm case of consequentialism that both are mostly used synonymously, but it is important to remember that very different kinds of values can matter from the perspective of consequentialism. You can claim that your actions ought to maximize freedom or non-domination, which is called republicanism, or your own interest, which is called egoism, or really any other thing. But consequentialism can get much more complicated than just having different theories of values. The way in which the consequences matter can also be very different in each theory. For example, do only the consequences matter that you intend, or also those that you did not intend? Imagine someone giving out free ice cream to people in a park on a sunny day. This clearly maximizes happiness. But what if, unbeknownst to the agent, one ice cream contains hazelnut and causes a serious allergic reaction to one of the recipients? If only intended consequences matter, the action of giving out ice cream is morally good. If not, then it might be morally bad. Consequentialism has to spell out many such details. Pause the screen if you want to see the many ways in which consequentialist theories can differ. Now that we know what consequentialism is, let us turn to the question whether it is any good. For that, we should look at the pros and cons. These might vary with the specific version of consequentialism, but here I want to discuss very general objections. It is actually not that easy to make a clear-cut argument in favor of it. Oftentimes, it just seems very intuitive that consequences matter in ethical deliberation. We already seem to presuppose that, at least in most cases, the effects of your actions matter for morality. But in hard cases, things get more complicated. And this is very often where the objections start. One of the central objections can be summarized with the slogan, "The ends justify the means." As we have seen, a central characteristic of consequentialism is that everything is on the table, as long as the best outcomes are achieved. If so, it might be that consequentialism breaks some very common moral taboos. Critics often point out that consequentialists will happily sacrifice one person for the larger benefit of others. Imagine you have a healthy patient walking into a hospital for a normal checkup. During the checkup, the doctor realizes that the healthy patient is a perfect fit for 5 dying patients, who each need one organ replaced to survive. From a consequentialist perspective, depending on the theory of value, it might be morally correct to sacrifice the one healthy person in order to save the 5 sick and dying people. This, critics will say, is obviously morally wrong, so there needs to be something off with consequentialism. But this objection of course presupposes that the critic is right in their reaction to the hypothetical scenario, and that sacrificing people is morally wrong. Maybe most people will intuitively agree with that, but intuitions alone are not a sufficient argument. As they say in philosophy, consequentialists can bite the bullet and say that if maximizing happiness is what counts, sacrificing people is simply the right thing to do. Another central objection to consequentialism is that it demands too much from people. It does so in several ways. First, it might demand that we give a lot of our wealth away. If what we should do is to minimize suffering, for example, then we might have to stop spending money on non-essentials and rather donate that money to people who are struggling on the essentials. Also, some consequentialists argue that there's no good reason to give more moral consideration to those near and dear to us than to strangers at the other end of the world. You want to spend money on your kid's birthday party? Too bad, that money can go a much longer way in preventing deadly diseases, so it is better spent there. Whether or not these objections are correct depends in part on the theory of value that consequentialists uphold. And as already mentioned, consequentialists can always try to bite the bullet. But what do you think of consequentialism? Are the objections plausible? Let us know in the comments below.